The Wild West was a dangerous place. You could easily get killed by outlaws, animals, or even the weather. But sometimes it wasn't your enemy that got you, it was you. Today, we are going to look at how to be an idiot in the Wild West, because obviously no one was born knowing how. So here are some lessons from those who didn't survive. Lesson 1. Don't try to ban guns. If there's one thing that is universal across time, it's that outlawing something doesn't mean people aren't going to do it. That's why drug prohibition hasn't stopped anyone from using drugs. Just like how banning guns didn't stop anyone from carrying guns in the Wild West. The only difference is that if you had guns in the Wild West, they were a lot more likely to kill you. This is because law enforcement officers would often try to disarm people who were breaking the law. And since they couldn't use guns themselves, the criminals would then shoot them and take their guns. In this case, the outlawing of guns didn't stop people from carrying guns, but it did make guns far more deadly. A great example of this happened in Tombstone, Arizona. At the time, guns were outlawed, so everyone had to keep them hidden until they needed them. Then one day, two cowboys came into town and started drinking. They insulted each other, started arguing, and then pulled out their guns and shot each other dead in the street. Now, while the gun ban might have been put in place to try and prevent incidents like this, it only made things worse. All it did was force everyone to hide their guns. Had the cowboys been able to draw their guns quicker, maybe someone could have survived. But instead, they were forced to hide them. Lesson 2. Don't try to build a city in the middle of the desert. We don't know why businessmen kept trying to build cities in the middle of the desert, but it certainly didn't help their chances of survival. One of the biggest problems when building a settlement in the Wild West was getting enough water. Most settlements were built near rivers, but not all of them were so lucky. There were several settlements that were built in the middle of the desert with little to no water. For example, there was the ghost town of Gomorrah, which was built in the middle of the Utah desert. It was hoped that the railroad would bring enough people to the town for it to succeed, but that never happened. After the railroad bypassed the town, it was quickly abandoned. There was also the ghost town of Rhyolite, which was built in Nevada during the gold rush. The town was completely destroyed by a flood, which destroyed most of the town's buildings and forced the remaining residents to leave. But perhaps the most well-known ghost town was Bodie, California. Bodie was a mining town which was once home to over 10,000 people. However, after the mines ran out of gold, the population dropped dramatically, and today only around 500 people live there. These ghost towns are a reminder that water is essential for any settlement, and that building in the middle of the desert is a bad idea. Lesson 3. Don't try to rob a bank without knowing how to open a safe. It's not exactly rocket science to figure out that robbing a bank is a bad idea. Banks have security cameras, alarms, and armed guards. But what's worse than that is if you're planning to rob a bank, make sure you know how to open a safe. Otherwise, you're just going to end up spending a lot of time trying to open a safe that you probably won't end up robbing anyway. Now, this actually happened to 3 bandits in Texas in 1894. These men thought that robbing a bank would be easy money. After all, banks are supposed to have lots of valuables inside. But these men hadn't done their research. They had no idea that banks keep their valuables in safes that are extremely difficult to open. The men tried everything they could think of to open the safe, but they just ended up making a mess and wasting their time. Eventually, they gave up and left the bank empty-handed. Lesson 4. Don't buy pistols that explode in your hand. One of the worst things that could happen in the Wild West was to have your pistol explode in your hand. This was actually quite common and was usually caused by poor manufacturing. Exploding pistols were a major cause of death in the Wild West. In fact, it's estimated that around 1 in 10 deaths in the Wild West was caused by an exploding pistol. The most common brand of pistol to explode was the Colt revolver. This was because the Colt revolver used a system called the pinfire. Pinfire was a relatively new technology, and it was quite dangerous. Basically, the primer was attached to the gun's frame, rather than being inside the cartridge. This made it much easier for the primer to be struck by debris or moisture, which would then cause the gun to explode. The worst part was that there was really nothing you could do to prevent your gun from exploding. If you bought a Colt revolver, you just had to hope that it wouldn't explode in your hand. Lesson 5. Don't build forts on top of hills. Forts were an important part of life in the Wild West. They provided shelter from the elements and protection from attacks. However, not all forts were built correctly, and some were actually disasters waiting to happen. One of the most important things to remember when building a fort is to choose the right location. The perfect location would be somewhere high up with a clear view of the surrounding area. This would make it easy to spot any approaching enemies and would also make it difficult for enemies to attack. Unfortunately, some forts were built in locations that were anything but ideal. One example of this was Fort Bowie, which was built in the middle of a valley. This made it easy for Apache warriors to attack the fort, and it was never properly defended. Another example was Fort Garland, which was built on top of a hill. While this might seem like a good idea, it actually made it very easy for the enemy to attack the fort. The high ground gave the enemy a vantage point, which allowed them to pick off the soldiers defending the fort. Lesson 6. Don't steal a horse that comes back to its owner. Stealing a horse was a risky business in the Wild West. Horse owners were often very protective of their property and were not afraid to use violence to defend it. In addition, stolen horses often came back to their owners, either because they were tracked down or because they simply returned on their own. This meant that stealing a horse was not only dangerous, but it was also often pointless. One example of this was in 1871 when a man named George Yoakum stole a horse from a ranch in Texas. He was soon caught and brought to justice. Another example was in 1880 when a man named John Wesley Hardin stole a horse from a ranch in Kansas. Hardin was later killed in a shootout with police, and the horse he had stolen was recovered by its owner. There are many other ways to die in the Wild West, and we'll cover more in another video. But these are just a few of the many lessons that can be learned from those who didn't survive. Whether you're looking to avoid an early grave, or just learn about one of the most interesting periods in American history, there's no better place to start than with the mistakes of others. And thank you for watching.